Hi, welcome to Constitutional Chats, hosted by me, Janine Turner,
and Kathy Gillespie,
with students
Dakari Chapman
and me, Tova Kaplan.
Join us as we discuss hot topic issues with constitutional experts. It's sponsored by Constituting America.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Constitutional Chats. I'm Kathy Gillespie, and we are so excited about our program today, the Constitution and Immigration, with a special focus on Ellis Island. And we are very excited to have as our special guest today, Professor Wilfred McClay. And I will get to introducing Professor McClay in just a few minutes. But first, I want to start by thanking our sponsors who are making today's program possible. We want to thank Paula and Danny Barr of Delaware, who are sponsoring our program. Now, 3 of Danny's grandparents came through Ellis Island from Ireland: Austin Brennan, Annie Kavanaugh, and Ellen O'Donnell. And another, Charles Barr, apparently jumped ship when it pulled into New York Harbor, which is a fun and interesting story. But we want to thank the Barrs for being with us. They are great supporters of Constituting America, great supporters of the Constitution and our country. And thank you, Danny and Paula. So I want to introduce everyone who is also on our panel before I get to Professor McClay. And I want to start with our founder and co-president, actress Janine Turner. Janine is famous for her role as Maggie O'Connell in television's Northern Exposure. She is the founder and co-president of Constituting America. She launched it in 2010. And Janine is still acting, but is also actively teaching kids about the US Constitution, having given over 540 speeches to classrooms across the country. I think Janine is on with us. Janine, do you want to say hello? And if she's not, she's going to be getting on later. So we will move on to Tova Kaplan. Tova is a 17-year-old student from Chicago, Illinois. She's a 3-time winner of the We the Future contest, is National Youth Director of Constituting America, and runs the Youth Advisory Board. She's passionate about inspiring young people to know and use their constitutional rights. Tova, would you like to say hello?
Sure. Thank you all so much for being here and for having me as always. This is a really interesting topic, and thank you to our sponsors. My family also came to Ellis Island, so maybe we're on the same boat. We'll see. But thank you all for being here.
Great. Thank you so much, Tova. Now I want to introduce Jewel and Jorn Gilbert. Jewel Gilbert is executive producer, and Jorn Gilbert is operations director of Sing for America, a family-based company that the brothers co-founded. Sing for America seeks to show the art of truth and light through live performance. Both are proud We the Future contest winners. Sing for America is an actor-run theater company which specializes in semi-professional musicals, private training in the arts, school drama solutions, and public entertainment events, all the while revealing a colorblind world on stage. Jewel and Jorn are graduates of Moravian College, where they each earned a BA in musical performance and dramatic production. Jewel and Jorn, we are so glad to have y'all with us today. Would you like to say hello?
Yes, happy to be here. I think that these stories of Ellis Island are also such cool stories. So it's going to be fun to learn some history here and figure out what it has to do with immigration as a whole, and understanding it from last week, coming from the founder's philosophy of immigration. Would be cool. Has anyone seen An American Tale? Has anyone ever watched An American Tale, the mouse cartoon? It always makes me think of certain stories like that, of our like folk tales of immigration.
And one little fun fact is we actually have a coffee table that our great grandmother brought over with her from Italy.
Oh, wow.
Oh, that's still just in our house. We look at it every day and get to, just remember that journey that she took.
Oh, that is very cool. Well, I also want to introduce Dakari Chapman, who we're so happy to have back with us today. Dakari was one of our original panelists when we first launched our Constitutional Chats last March during COVID. And Dakari has been so successful in his acting career that he hasn't been able to be on lately, but he is with us today, and we are so happy, Dakari, to have you back. Dakari is an 18-year-old student from North Carolina. He's Constituting America's Student Ambassador, serves on our Youth Advisory Board, and is a two-time winner of Constituting America's We the Future contest. Dakari is a working actor and will be seen in season 2 of Netflix hit series Outer Banks. So Dakari, would you like to say hello?
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you to the donors. I'm so excited to learn some history about Ellis Island and immigration. And it's just glad to be back. It's like nostalgia for me. So glad to be here.
Yeah,
Well,
what's up, Dakari?
What'd you say, Jordan?
Just what's up? We haven't seen him in. Well, we went on a trip together with him and Tova. We're both on the trip in Austin, I think.
Yeah, Dakari, we're happy to have you back.
Awesome.
So now I'd like to introduce our special guest, Professor Wilfred McClay, my friend. Professor McClay is the G.T. and Libby Blankenship Chair in the History of Liberty at the University of Oklahoma and the director of the Center for the History of Liberty. He's also a visiting scholar at the Heritage Foundation's Simon Center for American Studies. In the 2019-2020 academic year, Dr. McClay served as the Ronald Reagan Professor of Public Policy at Pepperdine University's School of Public Policy. He served from 2002 to 2013 on the National Council on the Humanities, the Advisory Board for the National Endowment for the Humanities. And Bill and I are both serving as commissioners on the U.S. Semiquincentennial Commission, which is planning the 250th anniversary of the United States to be observed in 2026. And Professor McClay, I really enjoy working with you as a fellow commissioner on that commission. You do a fabulous job. Dr. McClay is the author of many award-winning books, including his most recent and one that has just been highly acclaimed in many circles. It's entitled Land of Hope, An Invitation to the Great American Story. Professor McClay was educated at St. John's College in Annapolis and received his PhD from Johns Hopkins University in 1987. So Professor McClay, welcome to Constitutional Chats, and we'd love for you to open up and just give us a 3 to 5 minute overview on the Constitution and immigration in Ellis Island.
Well, thank you, Kathy, and it's really wonderful to be here. And Dakari and Tova, I remember from my previous experience with this, and it's just a wonderful thing that you're doing for the country, and I thank you for it. Immigration is a very rich subject. In some ways, it's the core of what's distinctive about America. I mean, we have no nation certainly in modern history has been more accommodating to immigrants and more dependent on immigration and had immigration more closely linked to its sense of who and what it is than we have in the United States of America. And it really goes back to the very beginnings. It's a mistake to say, I think, that we're a nation exclusively of immigrants, because of course there was a native population here already, and that's a part of our history that we need to come to terms with. But not today. I think not today is a moment to celebrate the way that what immigration really represents. When I wrote Land of Hope, I briefly flirted with the idea of calling it, instead of Land of Hope, Land of Second Chances, because in some ways that's what America is. It's a second chance for the human race, at least for Europeans who, like the Italian immigrants and Irish immigrants and Polish immigrants and Greek immigrants that came during this great period of immigration from roughly the end of the Civil War to the 1920s, our first great wave of immigration in the United States. But we've always been about immigrants. From the very beginning, the United States was a country that had a lot of land and not a lot of people. So one of the reasons in the late 19th century we had so many immigrants is that even the large corporations like U.S. Steel, the Standard Oil Company, they would go recruiting in parts of Europe where people were particularly economically underprivileged, and would encourage immigration. That's how we got so many Polish immigrants working in the steel mills of Pittsburgh. It wasn't just a coincidence. We needed those people. We needed their labor. We needed their brawn, the human capital that they brought. And we've always benefited from that, from being a place where people who come out of very difficult circumstances can always look to us, and as they do today, as a place to make a new beginning, to start over again. So I think that's part of the whole underlying, some people would call it the myth of America, but I think it's part of the story of America, that we are a place of renewal for the world, and immigration is really where the rubber hits the road with that. So it's a contentious issue right now. It has been before. It's never easy. There's one reason other countries are worse at it than we are, is that it's always difficult for settled people to accept others who have different religion, different language, different practices, different race, different ethnicity, to accept that in their midst, to accept that diversity. But it's something we've been relatively speaking awfully good at compared to other nations of the world. And I think that's partly because it accords with this sense that we are, what I say in Land of Hope is, we are a country that really subscribes to the principle that no one should be condemned to carry out their whole life under the conditions of their birth, that we want to be a land of opportunity. And we'd like to be for all the world. We can't take all the world in, but we take a lot of the world in. And that's a big part of our story. Yes.
Now, that is a great opening to launch this discussion. And Janine, did you have some comments?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm here. Even
Hi.
though I'm not on camera today. Sorry. I had to go to the dentist, so it's just one of those days where I'm not going to be on camera. Everyone can have empathy for me now, I suppose, when you say the word dentist. Fascinating, open, thrilled that you're here. All right, let's talk about Ellis Island. We have so many people on a panel today that I don't want to take up too much time with too many questions. I watched this entire documentary on New York City, and it was really good. It was either by Ken Burns or Ken Burns' brother. I think it was by Ken Burns' brother. And I highly recommend everybody watch it. It's long, but it's a lot of episodes, but it's great. And when it talked about Ellis Island, which is your specialty, it showed the process that the people had to go through to get to the country. And I would love for you to elaborate on that, and so that we can compare that to today, because what's happening today is people think is so callous and horrible in certain circumstances, and yet it was happening at Ellis Island. I remember and everyone thinks that these type of things didn't happen in Ellis Island, and so I think the history really does hold the key to the future for us to really understand. I know that you had to be able to speak, you had to be able to write. But also there was a particular eye disease. And if you had this eye disease, you were sent back. There was no way you could stay. There were certain elements where they did turn people away. They needed to know that you had the will to work and wanted to work and things of that nature. And I remember I was on this boat in the harbor of New York City. And I was telling the story that if they had the eye disease, they were turned back. They said, no, they didn't turn anybody back. Everybody stayed. They put them in a room for 2 weeks. They put them in a room for 2 weeks and they got well. And when they got well, they were infiltrated. And they got so mad at me. Like I was just this horrible, terrible, person. And I said, well, actually, that's not exactly what happened. People were turned away. So teach us a little bit about that. Maybe I was wrong, but that's what I seem to have.
No, of course. And look, I think you have to have some kind of standards, some kind of criteria for this was all done in a very, very regular and regulated process. It wasn't a sort of free-for-all, frankly, that we see a lot of in the last several decades, particularly on the southern border. This was much more controlled, much more with a view towards things like would people coming into the country be likely to become public charges? That is, people who would not have the skills or the connections or the resources to be able to be active in the economy to support themselves and their families. So this is a real concern. And of course, up to the 20s, there's no significant welfare state in the country. So that's a consideration, has to be taken into account. Would people become, public charges? And by and large, the system worked. There weren't a lot of people turned away, but there were criteria. And of course, everybody knows that a lot of people with long, elaborate, very un-Anglo-Saxon looking names had their names changed to something that would pass muster. A lot of Jewish names changed to Golden and things like that. So there was that kind of truncation of the identity that people brought with them. They had to, in some ways, show that they were ready to be Americans. But Americanization was never a process of forcing people to divest themselves of what they had come from. And even if it had been, it didn't succeed, because these ethnic subcultures continued to exist and thrive. We weren't a melting pot so much as we were a salad of that melded together in a very nice and occasionally delicious way, but sometimes fractious way. But look, I think the more general point, people who were carriers of infectious diseases were certainly turned away or restricted, quarantined. I don't know anything about this particular eye disease, but I certainly know that generally, and it made sense, that you wouldn't admit people to the country who were that could be the bringers of contagion at a time when infectious disease was not well understood. It's not all that well understood now, in fact, but much less well understood at the time. So yeah, I mean, it only makes common sense that you would be vigilant about that kind of thing. But it's the interesting thing about Ellis Island, I think, for us, is that it's really with the Ellis Island, and Ellis Island sort of stands for something. It's 12 million people came through Ellis Island, but what it stands for is a real change in the character of American immigration. Before the 1870s, really, most immigration to this country came from Northern and Western Europe. So it was British, Irish, Scottish. That's where I'm Scotch-Irish. Germans. That's about it. It's a few French, a few Huguenots, but Northern and Western Europe, people from Sweden, a few. But by and large, you didn't have Italians, you didn't have Greeks, you didn't have and you didn't have from Eastern Europe either, Poles, Russians.
But a trachoma, I just looked it up. It's called trachoma, just so everybody knows. And it was this hook of the eyelid. And I'm going to continue researching. And if you had that, you were sent back. So I found it. But so Tova, you go ahead and ask your questions.
Sure. So I love this discussion. It's really fascinating. But I don't know. I liked how you were talking about how it kind of changed America's attitudes towards immigration. But I was wondering, was there a pushback from a lot of Americans about immigrants coming in? We see today there's a lot of anxiety or pushback against immigration. Did that exist back then, or as Americans,
yes,
were our attitudes very different? And in what ways was those attitudes different?
Well, I was just starting to talk about that. That after 1870, the texture of immigration changed, and you had many, many more South Europeans and East Europeans, also Asians. This mainly on the West Coast, but for the Asians. But so you had people coming from these areas that had not been characteristic of immigration before, and they had ethnic differences, they had religious differences. So Italians, for example, Italians were Catholic. Most Americans were Protestant, and in fact, the Protestantism of the 19th century was very anti-Catholic kind of Protestantism, by and large. So that really made a difference. That was a challenge. Italians had big families. Their foodways were different. I mean, all the things, you know, they consumed alcohol. The Irish certainly consumed alcohol at greater rates than the Protestant natives, and things like that make people uneasy. And of course, working class people were worried about their jobs being taken. Some of the same things that you hear now, that not so much today, but in immigration debates the last 30 years or so. So yeah, Tova, this is not new. It's a little different each time it comes up. And I think what I try to do when I teach about this is it's very easy, I think, to sort of be very hard on those who are being immigrated to and sympathetic to immigrants. We much more identify with immigrants, don't we? I think I do. But you know, I remember Spike Lee giving a speech once when he was talking about the gentrification of neighborhoods in the inner city. And he said, you know, we feel invaded by people coming in trying to renovate houses and this sort of thing. And that sounds like how could be against renovation of the house? But it's a kind of cultural anxiety. So I think when I say we've handled it very well, I think when I compare it to the French, for example, which I won't dwell on, but they really suffer from an unintegrated population that we're not perfect by any means in that regard, but we've accomplished more in this way of bringing disparate and divergent and diverse people together than any nation on the planet. But yeah, the tensions have always been there associated with immigration. You know, around the turn of the century, 4 out of 5 New Yorkers had been born in another country. And a lot of those had come through Ellis Island, a lot of those 4 out of 5. So not everybody, Henry James wrote about this, the novelist, and was very negative. So even highly intelligent, cultured people could be among the worst in sort of nativism.
Do you mind if I ask one more question, Kathy?
Yeah,
Sure.
no, I think that's great. Go ahead.
No, this is so great. And I love your point about, you know, it's easy to sympathize with immigrants, but it's really interesting because, you know, our nation is so new. Like, as Kathy and you know very well, as members of the Semi-Quincentennial Commission, it's not even 250 years old. And it really was created, you know, I mean, there were native people here, but like almost everyone here came from another country. And so that's why like determining our national character and our national story and attitudes is that much more difficult. Like, you know, in France or England, like they're so old and so many people there have been there for thousands of years, but it just shows how difficult it is.
It's difficult. But I think one of the things that helps us a lot, and you know, as in so many things, I really looked at Lincoln on this. He gave a speech once in which he said, you know, all of us who are the descendants of the revolutionary period, you know, can easily say, oh, we look 1776, right on. But what about the Germans who came in the 1830s and 1840s? What are they supposed to do? And he said, well, yeah, they can't identify and say, my father fought at the Battle of Lexington. But what you can say is that the language of the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, etc. That applies to everybody. That applies to me as a German immigrant as much as it applied to someone who was a son of the revolution. So that's something that I think that we have this principle, this idea that binds us together. It's not just shared experiences, shared blood, shared lineage. It's a shared vision, a shared idea of America.
Okay, so it says more than 120,000 immigrants were sent back to their countries of origin. This is on Ellis Island. And during the island's half century of operation, more than 3,500 immigrants died there. It said Ellis Island waylaid certain arrivals, including those likely to become public charges, such as unescorted women and children. So that was an issue. It also says quick, fateful exams. New arrivals were processed quickly in the registry room, where doctors had 6 seconds and they looked for wheezes, coughs, if they shuffled or limped. Children were asked their names to make sure they weren't deaf and dumb, because they were, couldn't be deaf or dumb. Toddlers were taken from their mother's arms and made to walk. So they wanted to make sure that toddlers could walk. As the line moved forward, doctors had only 6 seconds to check each immigrant for 60 symptoms of disease. So they checked them for 60 symptoms of disease. Of primary concern were cholera, favus, which was a nail fungus, tuberculosis, insanity, epilepsy, and mental impairments. And the most feared was trachoma. That's the highly contagious eye infection that would lead to blindness and death. And it says Ellis Island waylaid certain arrivals. We talked about the women and the public charges. Women could not leave Ellis Island with a man not related to them. Other detainees included stowaways, people they held back, stowaways, alien seamen, anarchists, Bolsheviks, criminals, and those judged to be immoral. Approximately 20% of the immigrants inspected at Ellis Island were detained, half for health reasons and half for legal reasons. And then as we have that statistic, 120,000 immigrants were sent back. So this is what I thought was really interesting about today, was to be able to compare what happened at Ellis Island to modern day times. So since that was what I thought the focus was, I just wanted to step back in and clarify that, since I brought that question up, so that people listening can understand the concept here. All righty, now I'm truly going to be quiet, and Jordan, Jewel, you can step in.
All right. The part of what's important about even discussing what you're talking about, Janine, in relation to immigration, is this kind of idea that we have as Americans, that we grow up with school. We talk about immigration, or talk about coming here, or talk about settling America, the Pilgrims, and we know that it's steeped in rhetoric in the classroom. We know that Columbus Day has become controversial. We know that when we talk about Ellis Island, it's discussed primarily just to compare it to what's happening right now at the border. And it's rarely based in reality, because either you have people who are saying something along the lines of America was always isolationist or something, or you have people saying something along the lines of America used to let everybody in, and we are doing a disservice if we don't. So you have both ends of the spectrum, and I don't think that's reality. When we talk about a book titled something like Land of Hope, I believe 100% this is a land of hope, like the professor has said. But I think the one thing that we do right at the base of kind of the start of this discussion that we have to grapple with is that we begin this whole discussion thinking about how at some point there was natives living here, and those natives were conquered or killed. Now, most of it was disease. Almost all of it was pandemic and disease. But that at some point they were killed and land was taken over. And this concept of that's how America began. And if we're being mature about it, we have to admit that there is no piece of dirt on earth we can go to where the original people who were living there are now in control of it. It's not realistic. And we allow this idea of that America is stolen land to infiltrate our thinking, so that when we think of land of hope, we can't get to land of hope because we're thinking it comparing to, well, we took the land from somebody. When we can't go to one place on planet Earth and it's a land where those people were there originally, it's not, doesn't exist. We can't, it's just not real. And we allow that to steal that national character. steal what we've become, because we've become the most open society that's ever existed, where you can come through somewhere like Ellis Island and you can take on the identity of being American. That's our heritage. That's our land of hope. How can, if we continue to disparage that by holding ourselves to some false ideal that there's somewhere where we could have, where the original natives could have never been conquered, and that's something that we should strive for. If we torture ourselves comparing ourselves to that, all we do is steal from a generation what America's beautiful heritage is. And Professor, I think that that's really a starting point for anybody to be able to read your book in truth and see your title and feel the inspiration that probably everybody on this panel feels, Land of Hope, that we have to come to grips with.
Wow, that was really well said, and thank you. I mean, I agree with everything you said, and I wish I could have said it as well myself. But would it have been better? One of the things that you raised is, would it have been better for the nations of Europe that were suffering from surging populations of the unemployed, of the indigent, of people whose only destiny was to be in prisons? We had the safety valve for those societies of the New World. Would it have been better to say, well, no, we can't go there. We can't let you go there because we have to observe all the niceties of the existing order, particularly an order that was not particularly nice. Native peoples did not have a sense of themselves as native peoples. They had a tribal sense of themselves that was very warlike and fractious between and among themselves. Human division and aggression are just universal facts of life. You said it very well. So what I always say to my students who talk in these terms and sort of say, well, I could give some examples of this, but that people in the 19th century, women didn't enjoy perfect equality in the 19th century. And I would say, compared to what? What are you comparing? What real world example are you prepared to compare us to? And of course, they don't know. All they know is that according to a standard of perfection that's outside of history, that's outside of reality, as you would say, we fall short. Well, of course we do. We all do. But according to a real world standard, a comparative standard, we do awfully well. And we have this sense that I don't ever want to disparage, of conscience, that we're aware of the ways we fall short. And I don't want us ever to be negligent of them and stop striving to be better, to do better. There's a lot of ground to be gained in that regard. But we're not going to gain it if we treat everything that we have gained as negligible. And that's exactly what you said in much fewer and better words than I did, but I just want to agree with you.
Thank you, Professor. Does the Ellis Island period, this Ellis Island period of immigration, when would you say the idea of Ellis Island, the character that it represented, ended, and our more modern way of thinking about immigration started? Well,
there's a couple of steps. I mean, the Ellis Island period, there's this huge wave of immigration between 1870 and 1924, approximately. And 20 million or more immigrants, many of them through Ellis Island, 12 million that we know through Ellis Island. Probably at least 20, maybe 25 or 30 million. We don't have good figures on this, but came. And it was all these different, very, very diverse sort of goulash of different people from different cultures and places, and really challenging the social fabric of the country. And it did, as Tova pointed out through her question, it was exhilarating to some people. It was upsetting to others. But that all kind of came to a stop in the 20s, because the anxiety level was high enough, the Congress passed immigration restriction laws that took this flood of immigration and slowed it to a trickle. And that's the way it was through the 30s, through the 40s, through the 50s, and on to 1965. There's a huge, it's part of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, that a revision of immigration to open it up and open up the ethnic categories. You know, the Japanese and the Chinese had suffered from exclusion even before the 1924 Act. And so you start to see, after this new Immigration Act in 1965, you see many more people coming.
Were the Chinese and Japanese then excluded during that Ellis Island period?
No, not entirely. No, not entirely. Yeah, although not many of them came in the country that way. Some did, and of course there's a reason we have a great Chinatown in New York City. But yeah, the profusion of Asian immigration that has changed the texture of our society, and not only East Asian but also South Asian, Indian, Pakistani, etc. That really came after 1965. We're still dealing with the wake of that, and the way it is. I think just as profoundly as what happened in the 19th century. It's changed the ethnic, racial, religious, and every other way texture of the country, made us much more diverse.
So was that immigration restricted primarily from their home governments? Because I know both of those countries went through great periods of isolation.
No, it was our doing. It was our doing.
Okay.
It was our doing, and it had
I would like to step in and go back to Ellis Island. So tell us what happened with Ellis Island that created the backlash, where they slowed immigration down. I thought that was interesting what you said, and Jill and Joy, I think it's along your line of questioning.
Well, it wasn't. This isn't specific to Ellis Island, but a lot of there were nativist movements starting in the 1890s, really, that feared that the country was losing its sort of special character, which some of these groups related to racial characteristics, others to more general characteristics, that people were coming from countries that didn't have a democratic tradition, and so they wouldn't understand American democracy. But some of it was out and out racism. You know, there's a variety of things behind. But eventually, by the 20s, these forces had gathered enough steam to become a national movement that restricted immigration. It didn't eliminate it. It slowed it way down from what it had been in the Ellis Island, the heyday of Ellis Island. And as Kathy pointed out, it was your husband's father came through Ellis Island in 1929. Is that right?
He did. Came at the age of 8, and he was on the steamboat Letitia, I think. And actually, my husband's father's father, or my husband's grandfather, had been over here for several years. He came more in the period that you were talking about, the early period of Ellis Island, and worked for several years before the rest of the family could come over. And so that's why my husband's dad came over in 1929. They finally were able to afford to have the rest of the family come over.
Yeah, and you know something else, Janine, that the cities were greatly affected, which is where most of the immigrants ended up, were greatly affected by the scale of immigration, and some of them were finding it very hard to handle in terms of, public health issues, sanitation, overcrowded housing. The Lower East Side of Manhattan was notorious for tenements that were just unlivable and breeders of disease. So there were a lot of things, and again, some of these things start sounding very almost racist in character, and sometimes they were out and out racist, but not always. In general, it put an enormous strain on public services and habitation. So there were a lot of factors behind this immigration restriction. That's all I'm saying. And
yes, Professor McClay. I saw the in the documentary they really focused on that. They focused on the tenements and the poor height, way they were living in the cities. New York City especially was really overrun.
Yes, especially, yes.
Okay, Dakari, do you want to jump in and ask a question?
Sure.
And we'll go back to Jorn.
Sure. I only have one question. It kind of just relates to modern day. So I liked how Janine was talking about all of the different, how like if they had this, they wouldn't let them in. And they were just like, it seems like they were just on it. Like if you got TB, bye-bye, like this. So my question is like, where's the disconnect for today? Like, why is this not happening now? What are the differences between Ellis Island and kind of the way that we're running things now as far as immigration? Are we checking all of these people for this and this? And it's like, bye, if you get this, you can't walk, you can't talk. Like, no, you can't come in. So my question's like, where's the disconnect? What's happening now?
Well, look, I'm going to be a little bit evasive on that because I think, I partly want to keep the focus on the history and not get into political issues. That said, I won't be totally evasive. I think that there are definitely, if you look at the two major political parties, they have different views of immigration. And I think the Democratic Party sees immigration as a net plus for it in terms of developing a Democratic voter base out of particularly Hispanic immigrants who it's assumed, I don't think rightly assumed, but leave that aside, that they will reliably vote Democratic, and Republicans make the same assumption, which is one of the reasons they fight it. Again, I think when people come and live in this country and absorb its ethos, they change. They're not the same as the way they came. But leave that aside. I think that's one factor. It was present in the 19th century too. One of the industrialists liked immigration because they wanted workers. They wanted workers in their plants. There's a little bit of that now. Many working class Americans resent immigration because they see it as taking away jobs. Again, I'm not going to get into whether that's right or wrong, but the disconnect, I think, is that it's much more two things. One is that I think there's actually much less resistance to the concept of immigration now. We are much more, I think, willing to accept the idea that that diversity is something that enhances our collective existence, not a threat. So we find it harder to say no, I think, to people, particularly people who are refugees, people from Central America who are coming from horrible economic and political circumstances. We find it hard to say no to them, and so there's less of a willingness, as there was at Ellis Island, to say, no, out, you've got tuberculosis, we're not letting you in. You've got cholera, you're not in, or this eye disease, whatever. We're not really testing people at the border for COVID. Just very strange. And again, I don't want to get too deeply into that, but that may be a factor that this is all more politicized in a way, in a partisan way, in an ideological way then and that kind of corrupts or gets in the way of the human aspect of the story, which is something that I think most of us have an enormous sense of empathy for. There but for the grace of God go I. I could be that Dominican who can't get into the country. I could be, that person in need who just wants a second chance that they know America has to give. And there's something to keep in mind. And this is another maybe disconnect, but everybody wants to come here. We hear an awful lot of internal strife now about our past and all the things that are shameful about it. The people who want to come here, they couldn't care less about that. What they know is, and they know from their relatives and others, is the promise the opportunity of America, and they want to come and avail themselves of it.
Exactly.
So it's still there, it's still real. If anything, to the rest of the world, it's more apparent than ever that this is a land of opportunity. Oddly enough, we're very internally, we're very demoralized about America. But I think not so much abroad.
Well, and we want to get over to Jorn, because Jorn, I don't think you've gotten a chance to ask anything. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'll ask one. So, Ellis Island, there's 12 million immigrants. And obviously, eventually that slowed, and there's new laws put in place to slow that. So first part of my question is, do you think that was necessary to keep the American ideal? Do you think that too many immigrants could have come and America could have almost turned into where they came from, because there would be so much of an overflow that it would outnumber the people that knew what America was?
Let me tell you, there's another factor I should have mentioned before, but before that 1924, we had a world war. And we had a world war in which Americans were divided in their loyalties depending on the country from which they or their ancestors had emigrated. There was a lot of pro-German sentiment in places like Philadelphia, where you had a huge German population, and in parts of the Midwest. And of course, Irish Americans, especially at that time, really disliked the British. There's there's this expression, twisting the lion's tail, which meant, making life difficult for the Brits because of that long, harsh experience of Ireland under the thumb of Britain. So we had this experience in the First World War of seeing, whoa, a world war, we could be divided among ourselves depending on which side we were rooting for and which side the government was favoring. Woodrow Wilson at the outbreak of the war in 1914 said, Americans are going to be impartial in thought and deed, which was an unrealistic standard, but you can see why he said it. He didn't want to have American Serbians, fighting in the streets with the American Yugoslavs and playing out the conflicts of Europe inside the United States. So that's another thing. The people who were the nativists who said, we can't let in too many foreigners who have divided loyalties. They had an added credibility because of the experience of the First World War. And anti-German sentiment among Americans in the First World War, it's legendary. People changed the name of Frankfurters to hot dogs because they didn't want to use the German name. Sauerkraut became victory cabbage. There were riots against the Germans in Germantown, Pennsylvania, part of Philadelphia. That specter of internal division because of too much ethnic diversity that played into the world's conflicts, that was a real factor in changing people's minds for the time being. So yeah, I think it's one way of getting at your question is you really can do too much or do it in the wrong way, have the wrong mix. And that's why, as cruel as it sounds, in some ways, immigration has to be kind of engineered to work to the good of the country. And this is another division, I think, but I don't think either political party disfavors immigration, but the Republicans, I think, would emphasize more, we should let in the Indian computer geek geniuses and those with particular gifts to impart to our country, to our economy. Great performers, great writers, great people of great creativity. We should favor them. And again, that's sort of we're all equal in God's eyes.
We're going to be talking about that next week is
Yeah,
when we
okay,
talk
yes.
about immigration today. But and thank you to everybody on our panel today, and thank you, Professor McClay, for being our guest today. I want to make sure we get to a few of the audience comments and questions, just
Yeah.
because so many fascinating ones. We have William Hutchins, who said, "I know a boy who came to Ellis Island by himself at age 12, alone on a boat. And then he traveled to the Midwest." And he said, "No question, just a comment." I mean, there's so many great stories like that.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
Barbara von Dimhagen says, "When I traveled to Russia in 2018, a lecturer said that America is a melting pot, but Russia likes to think of their contributions of the different cultures and traditions are more like a symphony orchestra." And I really liked your analogy too of a salad. I thought that
Yeah.
was great as well.
You know, there's one thing about the symphony orchestra comparison, though. You have to have a conductor.
True,
And,
very true.
you know, and
True.
symphonies don't just happen. You know, the singers here will bear me out on this.
We had a lot of audience members who like Janine knew that the eye disease that people were turned away for was trachoma. And you know, one thing that when I was looking at Ellis Island, I saw that the nickname of Ellis Island was actually Island of Hope, Island of Tears.
Yes.
And the hope obviously was for people who were allowed to come in, and the tears were for the many people that got sent away. And we saw a very poignant photo actually of people on a boat being sent away who were waving goodbye at the Statue of Liberty.
Yeah. I think tears also is what's left behind. You know, immigration has two sides. And, you know, I often think of the grandparents who emigrate, who still speak Yiddish or whatever language they brought with them. And they grow up, they see their children grow up, and then their grandchildren grow up. And in a world that's completely alien to what they came from. And there's a sadness in that too.
Definitely.
That's part of it.
Definitely. And we'll close out with Robert Zimmerman's comment, because again, that it's going to be relevant to our show next week, which is Republicans and Democrats have had a poor grade in developing plans and laws, even when they controlled the House and Senate. And that's very true. And we're going to be talking about immigration today, next week on Tuesday, May 4th. So we invite everybody to tune in then. And does anyone have any closing comments? Janine, is there anything else you'd like to say?
Yeah, we have 3 more minutes. So if anyone from the audience would like to ask a question, are there any more questions from the audience, Kathy? Jewel, Jorn, Dakari, I can't see if Tova's still on. Anybody want to jump in and ask another question? Because we have about 2 minutes here.
Just on a basic level, why did New York and why was Ellis Island, why did that become the center of immigration as opposed to another area?
Oh, you know, the Port of New York was by this time, you know, the greatest port on the East Coast of the United States. You know, and New York was the greatest city in the United States. It was a natural sort of magnet. It wasn't the only place, but that people went, but it was a magnet for them because of its, you know, it was the great city. Even then, it had buildings that passed for skyscrapers, and not on the scale of today, but there's so many wonderful descriptions by immigrants of coming into New York Harbor. And you know, because have you ever been in a boat in New York Harbor? But I mean, the scale of everything is magnified by being right down there at the water's level. And you come in and there's this huge vaulting. I try to get some of the cover of Land of Hope, that view of the New York Harbor, because that's, to me, that epitomizes what America can represent for people in that situation, and for all of us in symbolically in our various situations. You know, the opportunity to realize dreams and realize things that we never even dreamed that we could be and do.
Oh, I was going to say, since we have 1 minute left, what would be the message, the singular message you tried to convey in your book that you want people to take away with after having read it?
Oh, wow. Gosh, nobody's ever asked me that. A singular message. Well, I mean, they're part of a great story whose conclusion is not yet written. I mean, and we're an experiment. We are still an experiment, and experiments can fail. It's sort of up to us to make sure that it succeeds. You know, we've been pretty successful, but that doesn't mean we're out of the woods. We could collapse in a heap tomorrow. I hope it doesn't happen, but it's up to us.
And I'll step in closing. I want everyone to know this. Thank you, Professor. You've just been terrific today, and your book, Land of Hope, is I'm sure really wonderful. And we thank you for your time. And I will just let everybody know that this documentary that I've been referring to is called New York, a documentary film. It's a 17.5-hour 8-part series. I watched the whole thing. It's about the history of New York City, actually, and there are great segments on Ellis Island in it. And Tova, back to your question in closing, what was fascinating to me when I watched this documentary by Ken Burns' brother, Rick Burns, is that, we don't really think of it, but New York City was a city where people lived. So many cities people go to work, or the cities they go downtown in their local cities, which is probably, unless you're in San Francisco or something. But at the time, that was such a unique experience to have this city where people worked but also lived. Anyway, just thought I'd throw that out there. Anybody knows the documentary? Professor, thank you for your time today. And
My
once
pleasure.
again, do we not have the most fabulous students in the world here? Young adults.
Amen.
They're not even students anymore. Jewel and Jordan and Dakari and Tova. And Kathy is wonderful as always. So we thank everybody. Kathy, you want to close us out?
Yeah, we just want to thank our sponsors one more time, Paula and Danny Barr, for making this great program possible. And we invite everyone to join us Tuesday, May 4th at 2 p.m. Eastern for Immigration Today.